This morning, we're focusing on that announcement made by the finance minister in relation to the revenue targets for 2023-24. Finance Minister Dr. Nigel Clarke says the government has options to address the shortfall in revenues once the full extent of the impact has been assessed. He's responding to concerns raised by his disclosure on Tuesday that revenues for the 2023-24 fiscal year has underperformed.
Fiscal year 23-24 ended on March 31, 2024. The shortfall for the last fiscal year saw government revenues coming in $22 billion on the budget. Tax revenues were also down by nearly $25 billion.
Speaking with Nationwide News on Wednesday, Dr. Nigel Clarke notes that despite the underperformance, the country ended the last financial year positively. The reduction in revenues could have implications for funding the estimates of expenditure for the current budget, but the finance minister says the government is committed to fulfilling the promises outlined in its budget despite the shortfall. And the Minister of Finance, Dr. Nigel Clarke, joins us now. Good morning to you.
Hi, good morning, Tona and Saeed.
Thank you so much for joining us here on Nationwide this morning. Dr. Clarke, if you could, for our listeners, just to give us a summary of what caused the shortfall that you're telling us about now.
Well, the revenue in March, which we reported on Tuesday, we normally report 30 days after the month end, came in $28 billion under budget for March. We would have been ahead for the 11 months to end of February by a few billion dollars. And so the shortfall in March by $28 billion meant that we ended the year $25 billion under as far as revenue is concerned. When we examine the revenue shortfall in March, there are a few things that stand out, or when tax administration Jamaica examine the revenue shortfall, a few things stand out. One is that revenue from corporate income tax for March was down by $14 billion versus the budget. The second is that there were several entities who declared a liability, but who did not remit payment in the month of March. So there is an overhang, if I should use that expression. And TAJ will have to inquire, review, and even use enforcement action if necessary to sort of resolve that overhang and see what the issue or problem is. So that is something, we have to learn some more about.
Minister,
the third observation is that the financial sector, observation that TAJ made, is that the financial sector at a consolidated level would have been a major contributor to the underperformance in the corporate income tax.
So, Minister, we remember speaking with Alison Peart, for example, tax expert, and one of her suggestions at the time was that perhaps government should look at the deadline, perhaps spacing it out, so it would enable for the efficiency of taxpayers paying their monies not only on time, but doing the filings properly as well. Having seen this now, do you think that that is something the government should consider? Would that rectify this problem, perhaps?
Well, let's just break that down a little bit. There's nothing that you can do that will get away from the sort of vagaries of tax revenues coming over budget or under budget in any particular month. However, the arrangement that we have where our largest revenue month is in the last month of the fiscal year,
March,
is an untidy arrangement. What it means is that you really don't know where you stand until the last day of the fiscal year, which either leads to big overperformance or underperformance. For the past 8 years, what we have had is consistent overperformance, and in some years by large amounts. And that is because you take something like GCT, which is due on the last day of each month. So it's due on January 31st, on February 28th in a normal year, February 29th in a leap year, and due on March 31st. Right? So that's the very, very last day of the fiscal year, and that's when your GCT is due. And so you don't know where you have your expenditure lined out. Your expenditure is less than your revenues, but expenditure probably comes in, before that date. But the bigger issue, though, is with respect to things like income tax, which is paid on a calendar year but becomes due by March 15th of the following year. One of, I have mentioned it before, I've heard others mention it as well, that moving that March 15th date to sometime in April would probably make sense, because the March 15th date, when you have your income tax returns coming in, is a big month of inflows, but it's the last month of the fiscal year. Mm-hmm. So you leave yourself open that if there is underperformance of revenue, there's very little that you can do in that particular month. It would be better to have it in April, which is the
start,
which is the first month of the fiscal year, so that if you have overperformance or underperformance in your heaviest month, right, it would not totally eliminate the risk of overperformance or underperformance. But if you take your heaviest month and put it at the start of your fiscal year, you're definitely on surer footing.
And in that regard, Minister, where you want to be on surer footing and not be in so much limbo with the March month, which is the heaviest month, what is holding back the government making the adjustments to ensure you're on better footing?
Yes, the reason for that is that in the year that you make that change, right, you're going to lose 1 month. All right, so the year that you make the change to say, hey, let's move from March to April, you're going to lose a month, which means that you're going to run a pretty large deficit for that year.
Which month? You would lose March?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's say this year we said, okay, it's no longer March, it's April.
Mm-hmm.
Then the $200 billion that we have programmed for March is not going to come in this fiscal year. It would come in the next fiscal year. So we would have, essentially, we were running a deficit of, $200 billion, or what's that?
But would it...
Wait, let me finish, please.
Yeah.
Or 6% of GDP.
Mm-hmm.
And in what has happened, where Jamaica has been in recent years, where we have had this huge debt situation and we're trying to deal with it, and we owe money to bondholders all over the world, etc. There is the danger, or has been the danger, that running, such a large sort of deficit outcome could, not everybody would hear or realize that we are trying to change the tax month. Mm-hmm. And you could get mixed messages that has a negative feedback effect on other important things that you're trying to do. So, in other words, in the context of Jamaica trying to rehabilitate its fiscal affairs and to pay down on its debt, moving that month and having the result be that you're running a huge deficit could lead to unintended consequences because it's misunderstood.
So there's no way to phase them or separate them and phase them in? So to ensure that you don't have that one big bulk of deficit one time?
No, there's no way to do it. It would be a step change. Let's use the word a discontinuous change, right? It would be there's no other way to do it. You move from March to April. Mm-hmm. It means that for the first year you don't have those revenues in March. So mm-hmm. It is something that the government will can do, intends to do. Let me use the word will do. Well, when we no longer have this concern of high debt, meaning And we're pretty close, right? By end of this year, we hope to be in the mid-60s. So I would say in the next few years, making that change would be feasible.
Mm-hmm. And Minister, as it relates to this deficit, as you call it, we're going to take the break. Would that deficit be reflected as an overflow in the next fiscal year when the month is changed?
Yes, you would run. What would happen if you change the month? If you think about it, you'd run a big deficit in 1 year, and then you would have the opportunity to run a big surplus in the following year.
Mm-hmm. Having a conversation, an important one, with the Finance Minister, Dr. Nigel Clarke, about the shortfall in tax revenues. Minister Clarke, at the opening of our discussion this morning, we told our listeners that you had said that the government has options to address the shortfall in revenues once the full extent of the impact has been assessed. What are those options? Say, for example, TAJ, over the next 2 months or so, the revenues are not coming in, they can't find the people, enforcement is kind of lagging, and you have to draw on those options that you said can address the shortfall. What are those options?
Well, let me just start by, let me answer that question first by shedding some light on 23-24.
Yes.
There was a revenue shortfall versus in March. You remember, for the 11 months to February, the government was ahead of its revenue projections by approximately 3 or 4 billion. Right, so for the 11 months, it was ahead. The March shortfall was a significant one that meant that revenues came in below. However, expenditure also came in lower than budgeted.
Yes.
Expenditure came in $14 billion lower than budgeted, and most of that would have been, the vast majority of that would have been recurrent expenditure, was $14 billion lower. So the target was for an $8 billion fiscal balance, and instead we ended up with a $1 billion fiscal balance, meaning a $1 billion surplus. Mm-hmm. So even with revenues being lower than budget from March by $28 billion, we still had a $1 billion fiscal surplus. I say that to say that that shows you in a single month adjustments that were made that brought the impact of the revenue decline. So let me use the word that absorbed the impact, that lowered the impact of the revenue decline. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes,
a single month, expenses were down by $14 billion. So here we have not a single month, we have 12 months. Okay? And if in fact as I mentioned on your program before, we have to see how the overhang of revenues, i.e. persons and entities who declared liabilities but who did not pay, we have to see what unfolds in the next month or two, month or three maybe. It would be premature to act before that because, you'd make definite and certain decisions, but you wouldn't have certainty as to what the flows are going to come in. So we have to see what those are.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Just
scenario,
right, just in case in the next 2 to 3 months it's still lagging, it's not coming in. What next?
Yeah, the worst case scenario, which is prudent for us to consider and to make contingencies for, and that's what we're doing. Mm-hmm. In the worst case scenario, what it would mean is that we would have to make some adjustments. And what I said on your program earlier is that we have options. There are revenue possibilities that have not been factored in and that don't involve any additional burden on any on taxpayers.
What are some of those, ministers?
No, including dividend possibilities. Mm-hmm. There are expenditure opportunities as well. In any fiscal year, as hard as it may seem, the expenditure that is put forward in the budget is never completely expended. And here we understand CapEx underperformance. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying just even on the recurrent side, in any particular fiscal year, for a variety of reasons, it's never actually fully, there's always a small amount that goes unexpended. And it's like finding a pin in a haystack, right, to find where those opportunities are. They exist. And what I'm saying, and we sort of have the experience on that. So between the revenue opportunities that may exist and or revenue possibilities that may exist and expenditure opportunities that exist, we, in the context of being committed to our legislated fiscal targets and in the context of being committed to our policy priorities, we, in a worst-case scenario, will find a way to adjust while keeping those two intact, our legislative fiscal targets and our policy priorities.
And I want to stick...
I have come out, and I came out with this information on Tuesday to uphold the principle of fiscal transparency immediately on the 30th, 30 days after the month end when the figures were finalized, and to make myself available to interviewers on programs like yours, because I firmly believe in the value of fiscal transparency for its own sake, i.e. making the public aware as soon as possible. But you should not read into that any reason for undue concern. I've pointed out that we are the main impacts of the main of something like this is that, oh my goodness, you'll be behind on your sort of overall fiscal program. We are ahead. Jamaica's ahead of its debt targets. Debt was 72% of GDP at the end of March. We are on track to being in the mid-60s by the end of this fiscal year, and none of these developments pose any sort of threat to those. We are ahead of our 60% to GDP target, and this is the value of being ahead. Right? If we were behind on those targets, or if we were just on track with those targets, having a little setback in revenues in a month of March would have been a bigger deal. But my philosophy, the philosophy of the government, what we have planned, executed, implemented over all these years, is to always have buffers, right? Because you can't be absolutely certain about outcomes. And we're a small, open country that, we're affected by many little things. Many little things can throw things off. And
yes.
So having buffers is very important. And in the fiscal arena, one of the very important buffers is to be ahead of your target. So we are ahead of our debt targets to the extent that this will not pose a threat to those targets.
Now, Minister, I want to stick on the matter of executing the policies, and some of the ones that people like, and you have announced them, people like them, is the reverse tax credits and the increase in the pension exemption scheme and all of that. That doesn't have anything to do with the tax revenues, because you said that the 25 billion that is set to cost is coming from the securitization of receivables. But you haven't, well, certainly I haven't heard what receivables are being sold and to who and for how much, and the opposition as well keeps asking those questions.
Yeah, so what I've done is I've outlined what our plan is. Closer to the time, at the right time, I will provide more details. I'll give you the parallel, Tono. In the budget, the government has outlined that it plans to raise $200 billion of loan financing. But at no time do we go out and say that, we plan to raise, financing at 8% in London of $10 billion, and then in Los Angeles, we don't outline for things that are market sensitive. We don't talk about them until they occur. And in every year, and in this year in particular, we have $200 billion that we have said, we have announced, we have written, $200 billion that we're going to raise in loan financing. And we don't go into details on those because it's what you call market sensitive. And in fact, regulators in other markets preclude you from speaking about transactions outside of a memorandum, right, that is produced for the transaction. And so it would be to the detriment of those potential transactions for me to violate that.
Okay, fair.
At the right time, just like I'm doing now, I will make all the proper disclosures and provide all of the details.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point, Minister, in relation to the market sensitivity.
That's going to injure what I plan to do.
Fair enough. I'll just ask then, how far along are we?
No, the process has already, how do you measure how far? What do you mean? How far?
You're trying
We're making progress.
There's 25 billion that you're selling receivables in relation to these very, very good policies like the reverse tax credits and the increase in the income tax threshold. How far along are you to come up with that money that you're planning to raise for those policies?
Okay, we have not yet. It's only the second month of the year. We have not yet launched that transaction, but we are, far advanced in the process of, selection of a firm to help to represent us in it.
Okay, and as it relates, Minister, to the International Financial Reporting Standards, you noted that it has some changes with the standards have resulted in lower taxes being declared. What have you assessed, or the TAG assessed, as it relates to the long-term impact of that? And what are the changes in the standards that have resulted in this?
Yes, there were some changes in IFRS standards for insurance companies, which affects what we call revenue recognition. Affects the time period in which revenues can be realized, and therefore has an impact on profitability. And if you impact profitability negatively, then the tax yield will also be negatively affected. That's not anything that we can do anything about, but it is a factor definitely that would have led to the March declarations for corporate income tax in the instances of insurance companies being lower than would have been expected otherwise.
Okay. Thank you so much, Minister, for joining us to give us some explanation as to what's taking place with the budget. That's the Finance Minister, Dr. Nigel Clarke. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you for having me, Ton and Saeed.
Leader of Opposition Business in the House of Representatives, Philip Paulwell, is calling for adjustments to be made in the holding of sectoral debates. He says the current conduct of the proceedings do not serve the Jamaican people.
I must posit that these are really not real debates, certainly not like the main debate where views and positions are argued between government and opposition. And we have to look at how we conduct the sectoral debate. Because over the years, we on this side, we get very frustrated because we have put numerous criticism of government policies, and we at the same time we proffer an equal number of positive recommendations which have been largely ignored by the government.
He was making his own contribution to the sectoral debates on a Tuesday. Mr. Powell says, with a review of Parliament's standing orders now scheduled, the opportunity to make the debates more effective must be pursued. Mr. Powell joins us now. Good morning, sir.
Mr. Powell? Did we lose him?
Hello?
Mr. Powell?
Mr. Powell?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning to you. Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you so much for joining us here on Nationwide this morning. Mr. Powell, you are saying that how the sectoral debates are structured now does not serve the Jamaican people. Could you tell us some more as to why you believe there needs to be a change in the structure and why the Jamaican people are not being served properly through how the proceedings are being conducted now?
Yes, well, the point I was making is that this is not a real debate. If you take, for example, the first part of the budget debate, where the Minister of Finance opens and there is a response by the person from the opposition or spokesman on finance, and then the leader of the opposition makes his contribution, and after which the Prime Minister responds. I believe that we have to reformat the sectoral debate to enable a discussion, a true debate to happen, so that on Tuesday, the Minister of Tourism opened the debate. We don't have our spokesperson of tourism in the House, but if we did, there should have been the opportunity for that person to respond. And in the closing of the debate, the person who starts it ought to take into account all of the criticisms, all of the recommendations, and to respond. We do not have that now. It is really people going up and talking without effective response. So you don't get the benefit of contending ideas being discussed and properly explained to the public and some resolutions in the end. Even if they ignore the recommendations, at least I think it would give the public an opportunity to hear the contending views.
I'm trying to remember now if how the sectoral debates are structured now. After the portfolio minister speaks, does it provide at any time for
Q&A or
no, for an opposition response of any sort? Not a Q&A per se, but any sort of opposition response, like how you just mentioned how the budget debates are structured?
It is definitely not so structured. For example, I am the spokesperson on energy, yet the energy minister will speak after me. And oftentimes, I don't even get there is no response to my presentation, as it should, if you are doing a real debate. I think what has happened, and both sides have been guilty of this, is that it's an opportunity for ministers to showcase what they're doing, but it doesn't get into deep policy discussion. And I think it therefore lacks the quality of the main debate that precedes it.
So, Mr. Powell, what you're saying is we should have, let's say, in the energy portfolio, the Minister Darrell Vards would go first, and then you would go thereafter, and then he would have the opportunity to deal with your points in somewhat of a rebuttal to close out that sector.
Yes, of course. And then when the debate is being closed by the leader of government business or whoever is selected, some recognition is given to the arguments that were presented. And there's no reason why the government can't say, well, the point made about electricity theft is a good point. Let us form a committee to pursue it. Or let us implement new policies in this regard. Or to dismiss it. But at least you feel as if there's justice being given to the presentations that are made, especially by the opposition.
For how long have you had this concern, Mr. Phillips?
Well, it has been with me since I was leader of government business. In fact, I was the one who changed some of the structures so far in the debate. There was a time when a minister would go up and speak for 3 hours. And people just got bored by what was happening in Parliament. So the first step was to limit the time allowed to 45 minutes by the minister, with a further extension, if possible, for 15, and for the opposition to get 30 minutes with a possible extension of 15 minutes. So that was the first phase of the reform. It needs to be completed now.
Okay. And at the time when you said you had the concern from your leader of government business, did you at all express this to your other parliamentary colleagues and indicated that perhaps a change needed to be made at that time?
No, my point was that the entire process in Parliament of the sectoral debate had to be a change. In fact, we not only limit the time that people could speak, but we also decided to put in place another debate for constituencies, because invariably when persons get up to speak in the sectoral debate, they would raise constituency issues. So we started a new debate, which was the constituency debate. What we now need to do is to reform further the sectoral debate to enable proper debating to take place.
When you first entered Gordon House and, looked at the standing orders, was there any indication as to the writer's intention of why the sectoral debates were structured this way? Why was it not how you're now proposing from the beginning?
Yeah. Well, I think it was really an opportunity for the government, and sometimes when these things are written by the majority, it really is positive in our view as to what the government wants. It was the intention of government for ministers to be able to get up and extol what they are doing. All I'm suggesting now is that having reviewed this, having done this for so long, and seeing the lack of interest on the part of the public, we need to go further. And we now need to ensure that it becomes a proper debate. So a minister will get up and speak about his policies, about the programs. Opposition will respond in kind, criticizing those policies and programs or commending if needs be. But then there is a response. What we have now in Parliament, and I mentioned this in my presentation, and 3 years ago, having done my sectoral presentation where I presented a proposal to how we could deal with the theft of electricity in communities, over 200,000 homes. Right after the debate, I put forward a private member's motion 3 years ago to debate that issue. To date, it has not happened.
So it shows that there needs to be some conversation as well as it relates to private members' motions. It's decided by the leader of government business as to which private members' motions are debated, yes?
Yes, and unfortunately, we haven't seen many of them coming to the fore over the last, certainly since the 2020 general election.
So how do you propose, a man of a lot of propositions, how do you propose we deal with that aspect of things as it relates to the private members' motion systematically moving to the floor of the House for debate?
So I mentioned on Tuesday that we are about to start in hopefully earnest the review of the standing orders of the Parliament. So there are some meetings scheduled for May, and one of the proposals that we intend to make is in relation to a private member's motion, so that there is a given time that's allowed. Just like how you have questions and answers, and they have to be done in 21 days, we need to insist that when a member posits a private member's motion, that within a certain time frame, and I would say within 45 days, it must be debated and a resolution come to the floor of Parliament.
I could foresee, for example, the timing being an issue with the legislative agenda and what needs to be done. The argument as it relates to it, don't have the time to do all of that. Do you think that is a very good argument? If it were to
We're
be made?
getting more money now as members of Parliament. We need to find the time to do it.
Thank you so much, Member of Parliament Philip Powell. He's a Member of Parliament for East Kingston and Port Royal, also the leader of opposition business in the House of Representatives that sit in Parliament. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us.
You're welcome. All the best.